I know everybody's kind of coming in the meeting, so we'll let everybody, I think we have a couple more that still need to come in. Thanks for tuning in tonight. We are here to talk about Heart of Golden, and we're going to have Mark from MIG do a lot of the presenting tonight, and then we'll have time for questions and comments that myself and Steve and Mark are happy to answer. So Mark, if you want to kick us off, I think we have most people here, so I think we can go ahead and get started. And we didn't sound check you, Mark, because we cannot hear you.
How about now?
Yes.
I tried to preempt the WebEx confusion with the phone. I just muted myself on the phone, not thinking about that specific part of the process. So excellent. Caroline, if I could get sharing capabilities. Awesome. Thank you so much.
I'm transferring to you right now.
Perfect. Everyone see that all right? Great. Well, again, thank you all so much for being here tonight. Really appreciate you taking time out of your evenings to join us to talk about a pretty exciting project that's been through a bit of the ringer through, given when it started about a year ago and knowing what's happened with society, with the plague and economic impacts, and we've taken that to heart as we've been through the process and tried to roll with the punches. So we're really excited to get back with y'all as a large group to talk about where we've been, kind of where we're at, and where we see us going moving forward. So with that said, let's jump right into it just to give y'all a bit of update or background, I suppose, as to where we have been. As some of y'all may know, we started with a series of feedback workshops broken into a number of series. We had a visioning phase and a refining phase, and it was held down in Golden City Hall there, pulled in the community at large, and had great conversations about the future of the Clear Creek corridor as it relates to this particular geography. In those conversations, we talked about program elements, about the vision, about principles, things that really got us excited about where we wanted to go next. In the questions that we asked in that process, we tried to establish some qualitative metrics to understand, as we get into the conceptual development phase of what buildings go where, what plazas go here, and so forth. We wanted to make sure that as we are ranking those against one another and thinking about which aspects kind of rose to the top, we wanted to get those priorities in place. And from y'all, we heard that open space and the natural environment was top priority. We wanted to make sure that that was woven throughout any concept that we looked at. The flexibility of space was equally important. Fiscal responsibility and thinking about the priorities is not just kind of the civic needs, but the community at large were equally important as we started to refine kind of what we were hearing from the community. Came back to y'all during the refining section of the study. This is, I think, the last in-person workshop I think that we held. I want to say before everything shut down. I want to say this was March 11th or so. So this was the last big in-person event we had. It was an exciting one. We had a lot of hand sanitizer. We were still learning everything about the pandemic at that point. We had sticky exercises and still had a great conversation. I had a lot of great comments about, kind of precedent imagery that inspired and precedent imagery that maybe we should shy away from. And you can see with the stickies on the board, there were a lot of great things that we kind of reviewed and discovered in that process, and things that we kind of missed the mark on too. So we used that third workshop to really start refining the different conceptual elements that we had put together. And at that point in time, and even up to now, we haven't gotten to a point where we're saying, hey, we have a concept, or we have two concepts. We have a lot of individual elements that we think are working really well together. We want to make sure that as we move forward, we package those appropriately to look for a preferred concept moving into next year. So in that process, we had an in-person event, but we know that, one single event on a given night of the week is not going to be able to capture everyone's input. So we replicated all those activities and hosted those online for a long period of time, and got a lot more comments. We built off of those that we had, the conversations that we had, the findings that we had during that in-person event, and we continued that an online presence for a series of weeks and months moving forward. And from that, we move forward with kind of refining the input that we received into a preferred conceptual direction. And I wasn't saying that all of the elements of this particular concept are the ones that rose to the top, but this generally had the elements that really resonated with the community at large. And in short, if we look to what those preferred elements were, it was really about trying to push a lot of that development intensity to the east and trying to preserve as much open space in the central core as possible. You can see a couple of zones here out east. You can see the central and the west. And that's going to be a consistent theme. We've had a lot of great engagement events throughout the past year, some in person, some online, surveys, small groups, digital activities, all sorts of things. And there's been a lot of different touch points with the community. But by and large, across the board, we're hearing consistent themes, which is always exciting. It makes the job easier. We're pointing in the right direction with not just what civic needs are, but what the community's aspirations are as well. With the thought of kind of consolidating density about the east end and opening up the central space, some of the precedent images that really resonated with the community involved kind of large open spaces and amphitheaters and passive walkways and places to kind of intimately gather or gather in large groups. And we want to make sure that the character of these spaces really carried forward as we move into refining what those concepts might be. So, or conceptual elements really, are key themes. Another one, actually more recently, we hosted a walking tour in kind of late September, early October. I say that generally because honestly, months and dates are a bit of a blur for me right now with two little ones at home. So I'm guessing it was in the early October, late September timeframe. But we had a great walking tour. There were 4 stations along the Clear Creek corridor at the Coors property up kind of to the northeast and all the way down to the Illinois Street Head Bridge. And at those different stations, we had informational boards, we had activities, we had great conversations with numerous residents across Golden. That was helping to reaffirm some of the things that we'd been hearing, but doing so in a way that I think we got to interact with more people that we hadn't seen maybe in traditional format with small stakeholder groups or large community meetings or even an online platform. So that walking tour, we took the information from there. And again, at this point, I've mentioned a number of different strategies we deployed to try and get, a general consensus, and we have data points across the board. And for the sake of y'all's sanity, we won't share all those data points. So that's a really, really big Excel table that we're kind of pulling all this information together on. But a way of building upon that is giving y'all a bit more ownership over the process. We know that, as professionals, we can kind of get into the weeds of like, oh, this building definitely belongs over on the east end and this one over here, and this is the rhyme and reason to that. But y'all know your city better than we do. So we used some of the direction that we had heard from y'all to date and started with kind of a design your own corridor piece. This was building off of the walking tour, all of the engagement points we had to date to try and add another touch point with the community that was unique and different from how we'd been asking questions to date. So through that process, we started with some of those base concepts that really originated in the, put the buildings out east and give us central space in the middle. And we took a couple of different flavors of that to start with. And then through kind of a choose your own path, looking at some key elements of the library, fire department, and museum, you were able to build your own kind of Clear Creek corridor, looking at if you put a library here, here are the key elements that we need to consider as we move forward. If you put a library in the location of the existing fire department, clearly the fire department can't go there anymore. So we looked at about 45 different options of where buildings and elements could be placed, and through that process came to very similar conclusions, which is great, right? We're asking the same question in a bunch of different ways, and we're getting to more nuanced answers about using the east zone to anchor the library, possibly fire and museum as well, maybe looking at different locations for the museum across the creek. Look at how those concepts came out. As you went through the activity, you would, by the end, populate your own kind of illustrative plan or concept for the area. So in this particular one here, the one that rose to the top, of all the 45 different scenarios you could have wound up at, this one had, not notably more, 5 as opposed to 4, but seeing that the central space is largely open, the museum has moved across the creek, and fire is down on the east end there. So again, that's not saying that this is the definite direction moving forward, or this is, we're basing all of our decisions off of this. But again, we're hearing some of those consistent themes about let's start pushing things out east and let's figure out how we can open up that central space that, responds to more of the community needs around open space and kind of passive uses. Some of the larger things that I've touched on so far, again, open space is key to the central part of the Clear Creek corridor. Civic buildings and some of those adjacent uses should be located to the east end of kind of the larger zone we're looking at. The library is one area that we kind of got a bit mixed feedback on. There was pretty consistent direction for some of those program elements, whether it was an amphitheater or fire department, but the library, knowing that its position could go, it could stay in its current location, it could join its civic buddies out east, it could do a number of things. That one there was a kind of a unique one, and as we move forward, you'll see that we still have kind of diverging directions within the larger kind of approach to consider. Some of those comments we were hearing during the time was really exciting about, some of the things that we heard early on, we're able to integrate and then carried forward with additional support. So whether it was the amphitheater or using some of that density on the east end that's being proposed to provide maybe parking that's tied to a shuttle that relieves some of that pressure and congestion over in the central and west zones. There were some consistent things that kind of came out from community comment that we'd heard and anecdotally from those first community meetings.
Hi, Mark.
Again,
Just real quickly, we've been asked in the chat if you could just slow down just a touch.
Certainly. Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I saw that pop up. So as I mentioned, we've had a lot of conversations. We've had feedback workshops, four so large community meetings. We've had walking tours. We've had online surveys. We've had online interactive activities. We've had council presentations. We've had small group sessions with 11 different boards and stakeholder groups. So the types of input we're receiving are very diverse, and it's quite robust for the scale of the process. And it's very exciting to hear that in those same in the differing bodies, we're hearing similar trends, and that's maintaining the West, which is kind of the area west of where the tuber lot is today, looking to try and provide community uses and open space in that central zone, and then concentrating development out east. There's some great comments about that east zone being this potential vibrant and active kind of node that allows you to kind of relieve pressure in that central area. Maintaining the beauty and open space was something that came up time and time again from community members, from staff, from visitors, and I think everyone generally appreciates and understands that is a unique element to Golden, and having Clear Creek as part of your downtown kind of Main Street fabric and being able to cherish and expand upon that was an important theme that we definitely heard from the start and up through now. As you can see, there's a little bit of kind of mixed message depending on where you live in Golden. Citywide, folks are really excited about new activity, new excitement in the area. Residents obviously very rightfully concerned about the impacts of what new activity and excitement brings, whether it's traffic or congestion. So making sure that we're looking at both sides of that coin. And that goes to the inclusion of some elements that weren't initially part of the conversation, but are being considered as we move forward. Even if it's just kind of conversations with residents to understand their concerns, their aspirations, or hopes, but residential housing and retail kind of elements, and whether or not those have a role in this particular area. So kind of split support or concern about those as well. Another unique element that we should mention, and it's been important because at the start of this process, we began with a space needs analysis that had been performed already, which established the needs, the growth needs and projections for civic uses, from police to fire to general staff kind of needs across the board. There was a cultural arts component that wasn't really part of that, but from the beginning it became, when we were talking about qualitative metrics of how are we going to weigh one of these concepts against another, how about a qualitative metric of we want a performing arts center? Okay, that's good. It's a program element. Let's build on that. And another consistent theme in hearing about the need for open space along the central portion of the corridor was the inclusion of a cultural arts facility. And that's a facility that not just caters to performing arts, but the visual arts as well. So that, through community input, became part of the process in the overall program that I'll speak about in a moment as part of our continued work moving forward. So that's kind of a bit of where we've been, and I appreciate the request to pause and take a breath and let y'all digest some of that. If everyone's okay with it, I'll keep marching through just to get through the next section, which is kind of where we're at. Again, not saying that we're at a stopping point or at the end of, hey, we've come up with the final plan for Clear Creek. Just want to let you know that this is a continuation. This is where we've been, where we've at, and then we'll wrap up with where we're going and then we'll have, hopefully a lively discussion, and I'll be able to thumb back through a lot of those slides that I might have glossed over a bit too quickly for you. This will be recorded, and this will be accessible coming out of the meeting. We'll make sure that you have the information you need to have informed discussions moving on from here and ask additional questions. So kind of where we're at now. So based on all the input we've received to date, I mentioned we're not at a point where we're saying, hey, here's the concept plan. Here's one concept that might work. And there are two, I think, that given all the input we've received about preserving open space in the middle, considering that I say middle, the central zone as that community, that core, whether it's park or culturally oriented facilities, the civic uses, let's move those out east. There are two kind of directions we've heard. The first of which is using that central space to just highlight two kind of culturally oriented facilities. An expanded library, Jeffco's library system there, and a museum. And those two kind of culturally oriented community type uses from a building standpoint would act as bookends to a central space that would be largely open. Across the board, this is a massive net increase in the amount of open space that's being provided, regardless of keeping buildings in this central space right here. We have a consolidated and a more intentional parking strategy. And by pulling out some of those uses, you can see that central space, and this is again here looking at the Illinois pedestrian bridge. And back here, this little guy, this is our existing visitor center. When we look at the relationship that the central zone has to the west in this particular piece, and again, this is I'm going to reiterate, I mentioned it earlier before, but it's important to take note that while these conceptual packages do put together a conceptual design that we believe is viable, it's not saying that any one of these is the right solution, either an either or one over the other. We're really focused on those elements and how those different elements work together. I want to make sure that through this part of the process, we're getting to kind of a pause point with some work ahead of us in the winter and early spring. We want to make sure that all those elements still mesh well when we hopefully get to a preferred concept come next spring and summer. On the west end here, though, you can see relocated tennis courts, the inclusion of some new program elements that we heard from the community, formal gardens, nature play, a pavilion, the more of a formal landing plaza for that Illinois Ped Bridge that has a relationship with the library itself. And looking over to the east end, you can see that Vanover Park is now flanked by a larger amphitheater, which is on access with kind of pretty much a view corridor that looks up to Table Mountain with some larger civic facilities over where the Coors office building used to be located. That orientation here, which from planners speak, and y'all probably heard it as well, we typically refer to as that's true north in this instance. We've oriented the map more so as what we call golden north, just so we can lay things out pretty intentionally on a screen. But this axis right here, it looks like it's coming out at an angle. That's our true north angle, looking straight up to Table Mountain there. The other conceptual packaging of those elements, based on the themes that we heard from the group and the community at large, is okay. That's a good step. We like some of those cultural elements in that central zone. Library, yeah, sure, it's already there. Museum makes sense. You've moved some of those pieces out. But what if you gave us the whole corridor for just open space? So we looked at a strategy where we might be able to achieve that as well. This particular one moved the library out east and the museum across actually the creek to join the Clear Creek History Park. Additional study would of course be required to figure out parking and access and the preservation of some of those, the design intent of the layout. Obviously some modification will need to occur, but those types of moves of relocating the library and the museum preserves, as y'all can see, the vast majority of that central zone for, as we heard from the community, open space. It's the nature play elements, it's the open space, it's maybe some of those recreational facilities redone. In this particular instance here, you can see the ball fields have been relocated. That's not to say that that necessarily needs to occur, because this is devoted all to open space. There certainly could be a variation moving forward with the ball fields, or part of one or a new one is relocated or maintained in this kind of central zone right here. When we look out to, pardon me, the east end now, take a sip of water. You can see a little more of a tight-knit organization of larger buildings around this kind of entry point from 10th as you're coming in off of 44th as you wrap into kind of downtown area there. So as you come through, we have a combined city hall and police facility there, kind of as your flagship building at the corner. A larger parking facility that serves the needs of not just these particular uses of cultural arts, library, city hall, and police, but also, as you can see with the blue line there, which is analogous with the blue line you'll have seen on the previous illustration, a potential shuttle alignment to try and, again, relieve some of the parking pressure, the traffic congestion, those types of things that we've heard from adjacent neighbors, like, hey, that's not great. Let's figure out a way to solve this. Trying to relieve some of that by intentionally consolidating some of that vehicular traffic over on the east end. So that there is a kind of a brief summary of a lot of work that's been done over a year. Again, I didn't want to rattle through charts and tables. I wanted to make sure we got the highlights of that there. And it's important to note that the Design Your Own Corridor survey, for example, you might say, hey, Mark, I noticed there's only about 50, 60 people that responded to that. That's not enough to make a decision off of, and that's a fair argument. If that were the only way we'd reach out to the community, I would have the same reservations. But as this has, as I noted, been part of a very robust engagement campaign of talking to everyone who's willing to listen, and some people who don't want to still ask questions anyways, I think that became almost a way of verifying that, hey, the things that we heard in every other type of conversation are not dissimilar from what we heard in the build your own kind of corridor thing. So that we thought was kind of it was a nice validation of what we've been hearing, the questions we've been asking, and now the info and data we're receiving was kind of on par with that. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Carly, mostly to give myself a chance to breathe. I do apologize. You all were very patient with me on that. Very excited to answer questions coming out of this, to go back to different slides and look at anything in greater detail. Again, the takeaway, if you took nothing away from my endless ramble, would be we've taken a lot of information in. We're very excited about the themes that have come out of that the community has driven around centralized open space and putting buildings as far out east as we can. And we think the packaging of some of those concept elements have put us into a good position to ask some more specific and detailed questions with specialists, with different program users, whether it's libraries or the police and so forth, to get really drill down into what some of those things might be to make these potential concepts come to reality as we move forward. So that said, I'll hand it on over to Carly.
Thanks, Mark. I'm Carly Lawrence. I'm the Deputy City Manager. I'm going to go over some of these next steps for a second before we get to questions and comments. For this next phase of the project, we really want to have some time to dig a little deeper into some of the questions that we've heard from the community and things we need some more information on. So some of that targeted stakeholder engagement for specific programs, what does it really look like to move the museum, having some more conversations with the museum, looking more into the fire department, and hearing that moving the fire department to the east might be something that the community is interested in, having some more serious conversations with the fire department about that and what that might look like. And then one of the big ones is the Creek Access and Operations Management Plan. It's not directly tied to this project, but obviously it's a big part of kind of managing that core creek area. And so over this winter, we're going to have a task force and conversations about how to solve some of those short-term problems that we're seeing over the summertime and with access to the creek. And then likely the way that Heart of Golden will interplay with that process is in those longer-term conversations with that task force. What are some ways that Heart of Golden can help solve some of those creek access issues and operations topics that come up when we look at the creek, so that we can dive a little bit deeper into the traffic and creek type concerns that have been raised by a number of people through this process. So we want to understand that a little better. Another sort of unknown piece of the project is the cultural arts facility. So we've been saying cultural arts facility because it's come up in a lot of the surveys, and we have very active groups that are interested in having a cultural arts facility within Golden. But as I'm sure you all can imagine, there's a lot of different ways that could look, and we don't know exactly what that means. And so we'd like to do some work and programming analysis and some research to figure out what does that mean, and what does the community want to see from a cultural arts perspective, and what does this concept that hasn't really been all the way developed, what are the different ways it could look. So we hope to complete some of those unknown projects to provide more clarity for when we come back to the community, hopefully in the spring, summer of next year, and really talk more focused about what are some ways we can refine these concepts, to bring some of the information that we've learned over the winter to the community and get some more feedback on different aspects of the concepts and different elements. And of course, like we've stressed this whole time, because this is a long project and not a short-term project by any means, we are interested in really talking through each of these pieces and doing a deep dive, and nothing's totally off the table and there's no decisions that have been made. We're really trying to narrow down what we've been hearing through the feedback and continue those conversations with the community. And we hope that when we're in the spring summer portion of the project, that we can do it in person and we're in a different situation than we are today. So those are some of our next steps. And I think, are you guys going to shift over to the mural platform, or are we going to go to the videos of people? You can go ahead and stop the presentation. Okay. So I think we can go ahead and start taking questions and comments from you all. If you want to enter them in the chat, you can absolutely do that and we can address them that way. Or if you want to take yourself off mute and show your video, we're happy to call on you and talk a little bit about this. There we go, I see some people. Go ahead, Michelle.
Hi there. I entered a couple of questions in the. Oh, is that me? I entered a couple questions in the chat, but I'm curious about the budget and the needs assessment, and also how this ties into some of the city's priorities. I know that they have a new strategic plan that they've pulled out, and they're looking into things like the justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. I feel like there's a huge opportunity here for that. And how are we tying that in? That didn't come up at all tonight.
Yes, thanks, Michelle. That's a really good question. As you probably know, because you're probably following along with sort of the JEDI aspect that the city is working on, we're currently going to be working with a consultant to do kind of an assessment of city services. And I think it would be a great opportunity to talk to the consultants about how we involve an equity framework into our projects, and a way to look at this project with that lens. So I would agree that that's a big additional piece that we would want to look at during this kind of research period of the project, and then bring back to the community more information about kind of what that lens could look like and how we can incorporate it into the project.
Okay, so that's going to be done, you think, in a time frame to impact the Heart of Golden, the direction it goes in?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't necessarily know if the entire project will be done, but it will be a priority to figure out what type of lens we can apply to projects and how they might recommend we could work that into this project. So I think that's a very good point.
Thanks.
And then the other question, I'm sorry, I remembered there was more questions you asked. You also asked about budget and that aspect of the project. Because right now we're really in flux and changing so many aspects of the concepts and really just trying to understand what the community's ideas are, we're not quite at that point to break down costing, but we hope to be there in the spring and summer. We also are sensitive to, what's going on in the world, and we don't necessarily want to be thinking about budget and this project budget when there's some real needs that the community is facing as far as COVID goes. So we're really trying to adapt to the world that we're in and be sensitive to other topics that are out there before we dive real deep into what the money of this project is like. Catherine, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. Now I'm unmuted. So I participated in some of the sessions probably before COVID because we were in person. And first of all, I really appreciate all the hard work you're doing because it's a great project and I think it's really important. And I guess my question is, with all the different options and all the sticky notes and everything, I mean, you've come down to like 3, and I just wondered, how are you going to finally make a decision? Because you've been really good about trying to get broad groups of community to weigh in. Is it something that we're going to like vote on, or I'm just curious. And then the second question is following up on the woman that just talked about diversity, equity, inclusion. I didn't know that, which I think is a great idea too. And maybe you don't know yet how that would impact the project. I don't know if it would come out in access or artwork or what you were thinking. So those were my 2 questions.
Those are great questions. So I think as far as the diversity and inclusion piece, I think absolutely it could look a lot of different ways. So kind of everything that you said, artwork for sure, access for sure, making sure that it's a project for everyone. A lot of the feedback we've been getting on this project has people really talking about what's for people that live in Golden and has that community feel and has access for families. And then also what's that visitor element and how does that look and how do we best manage that? So that's another kind of piece of that puzzle. Your first question was about
how do we figure out, or how are you going to figure out,
right,
sort of narrow down to the
final?
Yeah,
that's a good question too. So I think right now how we're trying to build this project is really checking in with the community when we are hearing a direction. We want to show what that direction might look like. So for example, the moving things to the east, but we also want to hear from people if there was a whole bunch of people that weren't involved in that part of the project and they are very upset to see everything move to the east, we want to hear from them. And so I think we're just trying to give a lot of space to hear all of those different voices so that we make sure we're not moving too quickly in any direction. But I think next year when we're narrowing it down, we're going to be in a better place to make more of those decisions, and we'll have more of those and more in-depth financial discussions as well, which will play into those decisions. And then ultimately, City Council has said that the plan will likely go to a vote with some type of tax increase possible with the project. And so that would be kind of the ultimate, obviously, decision.
right. And then a follow-up to that is there like on your website, is there an ongoing opportunity for people to comment on the current plans? Just in there,
So after this meeting, we're going to be regrouping, and yes, we'll have an ongoing place to list thoughts that we can make sure that we're not losing interest or not hearing from people through the next.
It sounds like those 3 plans are sort of still in play, but you're kind of leaning towards one. Or not really.
No, we have 2 that we're hearing from a lot of people might be the 2 that people are feeling the most energy around. So I think that's kind of where we're at, kind of these 2 that are up in the air. I have a chat question that I know Loretta popped on. The question in the chat is, has the city considered how public art may play a role in the ultimate final design, and is an appropriate budget being set aside for this? So we have met with obviously the Public Art Commission and talked about public art in terms of this project being a big role. And with the space of the creek corridor, there hopefully public art could be some way that ties the space together and really creates the corridor vision that is kind of the finishing touches that kind of create that cohesive nature of that big stretch. So we see it as a large part of the project, and it's the only reason why we haven't had more of those discussions on kind of the budget for that piece or drilling down more into that piece, is we see it more as kind of a later part of the discussion. Steve, did you have anything to add to that?
I'm sorry, it took me a while to find my mute. No, the one interesting thing about public art is it will be critically important regardless of which design direction we go. And frankly, regardless of if we do a big Heart of Golden project in the corridor, public art is already a consistent theme throughout the corridor and should continue to be. So I think I would answer the question as you did, that it will play a very important role. And no, we haven't set aside a budget for anything yet.
Loretta, did you have a question?
I did. And I think it builds on the two previous folks. So the designs look very interesting, and I'm impressed with the amount of work gone into them. But moving all of those buildings, I think, starts to increase costs significantly. Is there going to be an opportunity to perhaps prioritize what gets moved and to do this in phases so that if we don't vote in a huge tax increase, we can still chip away at the project?
That's a great question. So definitely phasing will be a part of this project no matter what. It's a big project and will be likely a long construction. So phasing will absolutely be part of it, and so will prioritizing the buildings depending on how the phasing works. And we hope to dive a little bit more deeply into that when we're talking about the finance completely. One thing we have learned from the building surveys and the space needs studies that have been done is that constructing new buildings is actually not all that more expensive or different than refitting the current buildings, because they're not designed for the uses that are as part of this project. So for example, the Miller Coors building is a good example of that, that when we really looked at if it made financial sense to remodel the building for multiple uses, and we looked at the price of new construction, it was fairly similar. So even though it seems that keeping old buildings might save money, it's not always the case, but I think it's definitely something we want to do more studies about and be really sure about when we're talking about it next year, so that when we're comparing costs, we know what the differences we're weighing are.
Yeah, Loretta, to build off of what Collier was saying there, and to your point, it's really important that if you decide to approve X amount and you only fund one or two of those buildings, those need to stand on their own, right? These incremental changes should build to a whole, but they should be able to function and increase the quality of the experience for everyone if we get one or two as opposed to three or four. So that's a great point to note. It's not just about the dominoes falling, but it's making sure that each incremental kind of module development is a positive impact and works as a standalone as we build to a larger whole. That's a great point to note.
And I was going to add, sorry, one more thing, and that would be, I think you had discussed, if there was a phasing plan maybe and it did not pass, maybe there would be a way to accomplish smaller pieces of it or have like a longer plan. We haven't talked a ton about that. I don't know how likely that would be just because of the cost of this type of project. The last conversations we've had with City Council have really identified that we would need a new revenue source to do something of this size. That being said, there still might be, as you said, smaller pieces of it that we can still accomplish if that isn't the case. But I think our hope would be to wait until the time is right to really have that conversation, and then hopefully do the project the way that the community sees the vision for it. I got another
Carly,
chat
looks
question.
like we have a question from Sorsha. I'm wondering if you feel there are any particular neighborhoods or groups of residents that you would want to reach out to in a different way at some point.
That's a good question. We do have, we are talking with Golden High School. We haven't gotten some of their feedback yet. We're looking forward to hearing some of their ideas. We're working with their engineering students on some ideas for the corridor. And some of the neighborhoods that we don't hear from as much, I know we had a South Golden meeting because that is traditionally an area that we don't hear from as much, probably because they're a little bit further removed from the creek area. And there was some really good conversations we had, but I think we'd like to really continue those. And then I definitely would say the comment that Michelle made about really looking at the diversity and inclusion of different ideas for this project. I think that's something that will come into play as far as new groups that we haven't talked to and heard from as much. So we'll definitely be working on identifying what some of those groups are and figuring out some ways we might be able to involve them. Dawn, did you have a question?
Yeah, so a couple things. One is going back to when the was bought by the city, or even being talked about. One of the priorities that the city asked to have staff look into was workforce housing being built into the Miller Coors building, and that was found to be cost prohibitive. But that interest in workforce or affordable housing has been there from the beginning, and yet all the conceptual drawings don't show it integrated in, and the last survey just shows it sort of as an add-on. And I'm concerned that if there really is a push for a affordable or workforce housing element, that it needs to show up in the conceptual plans instead of being just a also ran kind of survey question that gets dropped later. So I'd really like to encourage you to see how to integrate it into the conceptual drawings so that it sticks instead of being easily pushed aside. And also, I'll turn off my mic when I'm done with this. Kathy had mentioned, are you going to get more input? And you said you will. But a lot of the feedback I saw on Guiding Golden, there was no way to weigh in secondarily to say, yes, I agree or disagree. And I really hope you turn on that feature. If people are not willing to say they agree or disagree, so be it. We're on a social media world. But I find it frustrating that people might have an idea that I want to weigh in on and cannot do so. And I think that's a lack of input that is critical. I think that's it for now, other than just reiterating something that Michelle said around the equity piece. When you look at the creek corridor, one of the things I heard repeatedly this summer was when you shut down the creek, you take away a low-cost entertainment for people that don't have other options, and that equity piece is important to think about. If we put in a licensing fee or make it residents only, it's really not equitable around people's incomes. So when you look at the creek corridor, I really hope you keep that in mind as well.
Thanks, Dawn. I think those are really good points. The equity piece of the creek is definitely something we talk a lot about, and was a huge concern that we had through the summer. Obviously, this is a unique summer. I think Steve can comment a little bit about the workforce housing and the way that we've thought about it with this project.
Thank you. So Don, it's a great issue, and it's it's been interesting to staff to look at the input we get where the folks who have not necessarily supported workforce housing or housing in the corridor, I think are considering this as a quote civic corridor. And so the primary implication of if we were going to carve off land specifically for housing would mean it would make it that much more difficult to put everything of the public uses at the east end. But also some folks have raised a question about and the cultural center, which is being, one reason it's being evaluated is because it's a non-standard use for the city of Golden to be thinking about. And we wouldn't necessarily be providing that use. We might be facilitating that type of use. So I think it's real important for the community, if there is a desire for the community to carve off a piece of land as opposed to other lands that might be available in the community that you know about elsewhere. But if it's important to the community to carve off a piece of this land for a housing project, then we need to decide in the next 6 months or a year, or before we have a big package going to the community. But we got mixed. It was certainly early on one of the recommendations, and is important to council. So I think the reason it hasn't shown up here is it didn't get as much traction in the civic corridor as other uses. But if we've missed out on the community's opinion, now is the time we should keep talking about it.
I have a question.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I was just going to respond to what Don said about the access. I haven't actually tried to go on Guiding Golden and provide feedback. So it sounded like the possibility of actually weighing in on a plan and saying, I like this one better than this one or something like that. We cannot do that. We can only look at it. So I was curious about that.
Sure, I can talk a little bit more about that. I think what Don was referring to, so this latest round of concepts, we had it in a different module than we had in the earlier concepts that we had available to comment on. I know I'm talking in Guiding Golden nonsense speak, but there's one way that you can comment and then have other people comment on those ideas, which I'm hearing Don has a preference for that layout, which I totally get what he's saying. This latest round, we had the concepts and we had the ability to comment, but there wasn't, you could write a comment and then you could thumbs up or thumbs down the comment, but you couldn't respond to the person writing a comment to comment further. So Don is saying he prefers when we have the concept and then you can write a comment and then someone can write a comment and you can kind of have a back and forth conversation.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Something we can absolutely do.
So you are going to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Or it is happening, maybe. And so you can go in there and say, I like this plan for this reason. I think we should do it for X. And then Don could come in and say, well, I think that's a horrible idea, Kathy. Or he could say, that's a great idea. Okay.
Yeah.
And you're going to turn that on.
Yeah, so currently it's in the format where you can thumbs up or thumbs down and not comment. And when we put the next two concepts, we'll make sure we use the one that you can write more.
I think that's very helpful and constructive. And I think people would be respectful, but it would be nice to kind of get a feel for what people are thinking since we can't be in person.
Yeah.
So anyway, thanks, Don. And thank you, Harley.
And I have a couple of chat questions I'm going to read real quick. We got a question about the aging population and what we've done to engage with the aging population. I think that's a really good point. Definitely looking at designing an area for all ages, and we had a lot of conversations with Golden High School about that as well. You know, when they were asking, who's this corridor for? And it's really for, right, children to old age, all across the spectrum. So I think that is an important population to reach. And so we can do a little more thinking about what that could look like. And then another question was curious to see if at least one of the ball fields could be salvaged and still used as an auxiliary open space when necessary. That's a good idea. The ball fields have been something that there is a population of people that feel very strongly that the ball fields are important to the corridor. And so it's definitely something we're still playing with as far as, is that a good use of the space? How do people feel about it? We've heard some mixed feedback on it. A lot of people feel like that ball field kind of sets aside this space and people don't use it so much, and it's a small group that's using it. And so it kind of cuts off a large area to a lot of the community that might want to use the space. So we've heard a little bit of both. So we obviously have not made any decisions about it, but Ken, that could be a good way to meet halfway on both of those. Kathy.
Hi, thanks for doing this tonight. I wanted to go back to the very early sessions and back to the housing issue. It's, as I recall, in the very early sessions, there was exercise that we did where we put little colored things that represented priorities into different bottles. And it seemed like the housing container had a lot of little pieces of paper in it. So I'm wondering if you still have data from that and how the workforce housing did in that early prioritization.
Good question. We definitely do have the data. Mark, do you have those numbers somewhere easy to get to? It did not come out as one of the top 4, but that does not mean that it wasn't important or that it didn't get votes. So we have kind of been talking about the top 4 and kind of focused on those areas, but I'm not quite sure where it ranked within those priorities. And as we have said, housing is one of those that comes up quite a bit. The difference with housing is it seems like there's a lot of people that speak about being very, very against housing, and people that are very, very interested in seeing housing as part of the project. Very against housing as part of this project, I should say. And so we've heard from a few on kind of both ends of that spectrum, but we have not heard kind of a lot of voices looking for the housing in the project. But you know, that's why we have these conversations, and this is one of the ways we're collecting feedback. And we've heard several people today bring it up, and we've read several comments about it. And so there might be enough of it sounds like there's enough of an interest that we should probably go back to the drawing board and look at what are some ways we might be able to involve housing in a way that still honors kind of where people are the most not interested in having housing as part of this project. So we'll look a little bit more into it, I think. Steve, do you have any other follow-ups? I know I have some chat questions too.
No, I'm ready to answer the next couple chats.
Can you define workforce housing?
So workforce housing is generally considered to be a cohort in the range of about 100 to 120+% of the area median household income, which doesn't mean anything to most folks, but it is the area of federally subsidized housing, which is generally called affordable housing or lower income housing, is for folks who are households that generally are making between 30 and 80% of the area median income. Workforce housing is generally defined as that which what in the pandemic we're calling those critical workers, nurses, teachers, fire persons, retail workers, what they would need. So 120% of area median income for a family of 4 is probably about $80,000 a year income. So that's what workforce is compared to affordable. There's 2 chat questions that are the same question. Actually, there's a bunch of questions all of a sudden have showed up. One from Don that shows up twice is about Coors Tech. And it refers to the downtown Coors Tech facility at 609th Street between Ford and Washington north of 10th, but not counting the American Mountaineering Center or the small house. And in recent months, they have actually acknowledged, not so much publicly, but so widespreadly, that they are planning to consider moving out of that facility in the coming years and starting to do planning for what they want to do. I don't know that we'll see anything come to the city for a year or two, but they are starting to think about it. And it's less likely. Don's question was, if they're moving out soon enough, are they moving out soon enough to make us want to talk to them about space for municipal use like fire or library, or is it strictly going to be private development with no partnership? I think it's very likely to be a partnership, and I think it's very likely that because of the role of the Downtown Development Authority, there will be an opportunity to leverage the project. I think it's unlikely that something like police or fire could ever be in there because of their logistical needs, and probably not City Hall, but there is always the opportunity to incorporate museum or some other public, but not necessarily City Hall uses pretty easily, or to have shared parking. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. It's hard to know. A year ago, it looked like we would be ahead of them, and now it looks like they might be ahead of us, so that there's lots of opportunity to work with them. And I think there was a couple more questions about housing and what workforce housing is. One that says, perhaps you should address where the city of Golden stands RE workforce affordable housing. The city's comprehensive plan has housing goals for us to maintain a balance of housing and to try to reduce the number of housing burdened households in the community. Households, and Kathy or Don might speak to this better than me, being housing burdened is defined as paying more than 30% of your household income on housing and utilities. And there are a lot of people in this world, especially in this country and in Colorado, who fall into that category. So that's one of the metrics that we use. In the city's council strategic plan, they are looking for strategies related to that. In the past, we've mostly been focusing on regulatory barriers, such as recently there was an amendment to our residential growth management program that allows borrowing allocations from the future for housing programs. For the city to actually get into the business of building and owning, or building and not owning housing, would be a policy decision that I don't think council has made yet. So we have goals to support it. We've taken actions to support it. We've made investments in things like rental assistance and housing rehab to support it, but the city council has not identified the city actually building housing as a strategy that they're officially endorsing yet.
Kathy?
I think I might have gotten most of them.
Yeah, good job.
Just to clarify, I'm not sure the city really has to build the housing. The Foothills Regional Housing could build the housing. One of the expensive parts is the land. So just providing land for housing could be.
And that actually is a strategy of the Downtown Development Authority and GURA. We've just yet to have an opportunity to acquire land.
Bob, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. Thanks. Hi, everyone. I don't know if it's a question or maybe just a comment or a concern that we have. My wife and I own a property that's right at 410 9th Street. And we're both excited and somewhat apprehensive about the progress and what's going to go where and how things are going to be laid out eventually. And, I have to say I'm kind of nervous about some of the ideas of having the firehouse located right across the street from us. My wife's an acupuncturist. It's a wellness center. I think that would be very disruptive to those businesses. We're concerned that those types of decisions could adversely affect our property values. And there's also some residences right around that area as well. And I have to admit, it sure seems like everybody says, yeah, move it all out east because there's not as many people out east and that sort of thing. And we're being kind of picked on. And I just don't know what the outcome of that's going to be. So I don't know if there's a question. I don't know if there's a concern. I'm not quite sure how to contend that and how that fits in the spectrum of the whole plan. But I think it's something hopefully you'll take seriously into consideration when you're deciding what to move and where. Because, people in the central part of the people who live near the firehouse now probably are ecstatic that you're going to move it. And we're not excited about it being right across the street. So I just wanted to, relay that opinion, that position.
Thank you. It's really good to hear, different opinions like that and bring up things that we can think about as we're planning. And as we've said, we haven't made any decisions. And so comments like that help us to weigh some of those decisions. So I think it's really important that you shared that, and I really appreciate it. Don?
Yeah, a couple quick follow-ups. One is I'm not sure about Steve's answer on the logistics of having fire and police buried, I'm going to just use that term, buried down 10th Street past Ford, whereas if the Coors Tech property were to become available, it's more accessible logistically to our regional roads. So I'm not sure why waiting and dealing with Coors Tech has a downside with regards to other municipal uses. That's just a comment. The other thing I wanted to weigh in on, at the risk of pissing some people off, is years ago when I was on the Citizens Task Force with Steve on identifying some priorities to spend money, a cultural arts center was definitely brought up. But we looked at some of the costs associated with that, and I don't know if you guys know this, but Arvada spends over $1 million a year to support their $10 million arts center, of which they've also spent over $70 million on over the years. So having a cultural arts center of that size, when people say, let's have something like the Arvada Arts Center, they got to recognize that it was a multi-year, multi-bonded, financed enterprise. Whereas the Cultural Arts Center that people proposed just 2 years ago was, I believe, $16 million and 9,000 square feet. And maybe Steve could correct me on that. But I would hope that people are thinking in terms of something that is commensurate with the size of Golden and not a regional arts center that we're going to try to compete for venues, visitors, et cetera, with, Budweiser Center or, whatever. There's a lot of cultural arts center that are regional. And I hope that people are thinking in terms of this being very much city size. And so I'd like some more clarity on that.
Sure. I think those are really good questions and points. And in a lot of ways, those questions came up for us, during this process. And that's why we really feel like a deeper dive into what we mean by cultural facility, a bigger study into that over the next few months is really needed, just because there's a lot of ways that the funding comes into play. There's a lot of ways that it could look, there's a lot of different, as you said, size, partnerships, people involved, and different, even kind of outside the box offerings for the community. One of the things we even mentioned was one thing we've heard is nonprofit space or a hub of the community for people to meet and to support some of the smaller nonprofits. That's something that's come up. You know, one of the questions is, could there be a way of that to be, a way for that to be incorporated into this cultural idea? Because this cultural facility idea is not all the way presented as a full concept, it's difficult to answer those questions. So I think what we need to do is do more research and more work to think about what that could look like and what's the right cultural facility for Golden, kind of as you said. So I think you're right on target with those questions, and those are things that we want to figure out over the next few months.
Carly, I would say those the lack of I guess details on some of that made it hard to answer some of the survey questions. So I went to try to answer some of the surveys, and do you want a cultural center? Well, I don't want a $70 million cultural center, but like 5 or 10 million, like maybe if it makes sense. So some of the surveys, you know, moving forward, when you structure them, if you can like allow for some of that, some sort of comments or feedback on some of that, that might be helpful so that we can provide input that makes more sense.
Yes, good point.
Also, just one quick comment. I made a comment in the chat, but it seems to be overlooked a couple of times.
Sorry.
I just asked if has there been any consideration of acknowledging that Golden is located on historic tribal lands? I'm not sure what that would look like, if it would be a monument or if it would be, you know, if we do have a cultural center, do we have some sort of display or acknowledgement of that? It just seems like some acknowledgement would be appropriate or appreciated.
I'm sorry, it never showed up in my chat, so I never saw it. I think that's a really good point to bring up, and so I think that could definitely be part of the conversations that we're having as we're looking at public art and those types of aspects of the project. And clearly that could also come into play with working with the consultant on the equity lens and how that could interface with the project. So I think that's a really great thing to bring up.
I just want to say thanks, Michelle. I totally agree with her on that. I was just a part of a conference, and each of us, the Wilderness Risk Managers Conference that I've been doing for many years, each of us was required to precede our session with an acknowledgement of the land upon which we were standing, the native lands. It was really interesting and helpful, and so I agree with her on that. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks. If there's no other questions or comments, I think we'll start wrapping up. If anybody has any last minute things they want to add, feel welcome. Of course, this is not the last conversation we're having about this. There will be many more. And even though I've talked about these next few months as doing some of that research and some of that not necessarily as front-facing engagement work, we will still keep Guiding Golden open, and we will still have ways of providing feedback, and we'll still be presenting this information at council meetings and other meetings. So you will still be seeing us plenty. We'll just be doing some of that deep dive work that we referred to.
Hey, Carly. I had a couple of questions in the chat. I guess maybe they didn't pop up either. The first one was just regarding I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, are you Greg?
Yeah, I'm Greg, thank you.
Okay.
Sorry. No video here, but the first one was just kind of considering, I saw a lot of the comments about the museum and the library, and, you know, maybe they're not exactly where we would love them to be, but they were both recently remodeled and, you know, seem to be functioning fairly well as they're existing. And, I've used both of those places and they seem suitable to me. So I'm just wondering if there's any thought on creating another iteration of the design where these structures, including those and possibly the fire station, remain in place, and then maybe the older, outdated city hall buildings are consolidated out east, and we kind of rework things in such a non-disruptive manner, and all the proposals that have been put forth so far seem to be really dramatic and we just have to like, it's like move everything to exactly where we want it. Whereas maybe we could have a more reasonable plan that keeps certain things where they are because they're very functional. And, maybe like moving those city buildings that we would like to have consolidated back east and have a better use for those spaces near the creek, near the rec center. Some of that makes sense. Maybe those buildings are small, outdated, et cetera. But, it seems like there's a more halfway plan that could be drawn up and achieve 90% of what we've achieved with the plans that have been drawn out so far.
Thanks, Greg. That's a good question. So early on when we were having some of these conversations, specifically, I can start with the library. It is one of the most used libraries in the Jefferson County library system, so it's one of the busiest. And it is actually very small for their needs. And oftentimes for story time, they've had lines going outside and don't have the space to accommodate people interested in story time. So our conversations with the library have shown that they're very interested in a larger space. And that building was formerly a loosely termed rec center of the cities many years ago. And so it was never really designed to be a library. And so I think from their perspective, it doesn't really address their needs. The museum has been remodeled and addresses some of the needs currently, but it is pretty small and they are interested in having more space as well, space for storage and more exhibit space. And so they have sort of expressed similar sentiments that the space wasn't designed to be a museum and a bigger space might be really helpful for them. That being said, your point about even maybe a phased option of what are those priority buildings and what order does that go in if we're talking about a really long project, that's a really big project, maybe that could look a lot of different ways. So I don't think that it's totally off the table to keep those buildings or keep those uses in those buildings, but both have expressed that they have needs that are not currently being met in those buildings.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I think, there were enough comments on the guiding golden that it would make sense to at least, make sense when you say it that, those users are also looking for larger spaces and they're outgrowing those. That makes sense. The other, the second question I had real quick was, I don't know if there's any consideration given to, increasing not just the public green space along the creek, but possibly even enhancing commercial space along the creek. I know it's not really the role of the town with the property that, the town owns or the public owns along the creek, but it would also, I think, increase the usability and enjoyment of the people along the creek if, instead of just a 4-story apartment building, 15 feet from the creek, maybe there was a more usable commercial space with some outdoor seating, where you could have a couple of additional restaurant spaces. And I think the Golden Mill is going to achieve some of that too, but it would be nice to have a little more, critical mass along the creek where, hey, let's go walk along the creek and find a place for dinner kind of thing. So I think that would be a nice addition.
Thanks for that idea, Greg. You're one of the few brave souls willing to share that idea. It is expressed by a few in the community, but there are definitely a lot of people in the community that feel extremely strongly that that should not be the case. So we'll continue having these conversations and trying to figure out how the community really feels about those kind of topics. But that is one of them that a few people have brought up and have some real excitement about it. And some people feel very strongly against it.
Sure, I believe that. Thanks, Carly.
Thank you. Michelle?
Yeah, so getting back to Greg's first comment on the idea of using existing facilities rather than moving them or making them ideal. And earlier we talked a little bit about budget and how the city isn't really ready to put actual numbers onto this. But I feel like we'd be getting different answers to those questions if we were to say, okay, let's like moving the library would cost this much, and this is how much it would impact your taxes. So like this plan would cost your taxes this much. And, but if we kept everything the way it is, maybe put like an extra annex on the library or do, expand it a little bit of this, a little bit of that, which, isn't ideal, but maybe people might actually be down with that more if they knew how much difference it made in terms of the cost. So I feel like this whole like, oh, pie in the sky thing, if we're going to be moving forward with something, I think we really need to have some numbers and have some options that are like, this is the pie in the sky. This is how much it would cost. Order of magnitude. Is it 10 million? Is it 100 million? Like, what are we talking about? And this is like a different option. That would be really, really nice and might match people's idea of like what a tax increase they might be willing to spend. So I just feel like that's like a missing in the conversation. I know that initially there was the like how important is fiscal responsibility, and that's not quite as like sexy as making things cool or nice or outdoor space, and so it didn't get I think it maybe didn't get a lot of traction. But I think when it comes down to voting for things, people aren't going to want to spend boatloads of money. So just a consideration that we kind of need to be starting to think about some of those practical pieces, or at least have solutions that are a range of costs so that we can make better decisions.
I think that's a really great comment. Thank you for that. You're absolutely correct. And what you're describing is exactly how we envisioned. We wanted to talk about that earlier this year in kind of early summer as we were envisioning this project further. And really that trade-off conversation, right? That's how we can understand what's the entry level and what is the Cadillac version or the phased, and exactly what you said about the buildings. If keeping the old library costs you this much and building a new library costs you that much, how do you feel about that, right? Like those real concrete decisions. So that is absolutely what we intended to do early this year. And with COVID have just determined that having those monetary discussions with this project is really difficult. And talking about raising taxes and what people can imagine, it's just really not the right time to be diving deep into those conversations. So that's why we're hoping that we can kind of dig a little deeper into some of these other pieces, and then hopefully next year we're in a better space as a community and country and all the things, and we can do exactly what you're describing and really identify what people's preferences are. So it might seem like we're spending more time in the pie in the sky stage than one might design a project, but that's because that's true. We purposely have kind of pushed other things aside and decided to try to keep it in kind of this visioning, exciting part of the project instead of rushing ahead. So thank you for that comment. All right. I think that might be it. Oh, I hear something.
I think I might have, yeah, that's me. I might have Kyra actually share her screen just real quickly, and
okay,
so you'll know that we haven't been nodding our heads just diligently through the whole process. We have been capturing all of your comments, categorizing them, making sure that we're understanding what you're asking overall, how that helps us move forward. So we've been diligently tracking on the backside to make sure that we're catching everything, copying and pasting from the chat log. Kyra has broken a sweat by this point, I imagine. She's a quick typer, but there's a lot of information there. She types almost as quick as I talk. It's really impressive. So, I think we have a lot of information to move forward with. So thank you again for all the comments, Kyra. Alex, thank you so much for working behind the scenes diligently through this. There's a lot of great information. I can't read it, so I'm assuming there's a lot of it.
Thanks to all of you for all your hard work.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much.
Perfect. Back to you, Carly. Sorry about that.
No, that's great. I'm glad you shared it. And Kyra, this looks lovely. And I'm really glad we have all this great information. We'll keep in touch with you all. And thank you so much for taking the time to attend this meeting. And we'll come back to talk to you soon.
Thank you. Good night.
Night.
Thanks, everyone. Y'all take care. Have a great evening.